There was a time in America when telling the truth could get you killed. Not metaphorically, not politically, literally. There was a time when a black person could be dragged from a jail cell, tortured, mutilated, burned, and murdered in front of cheering crowds, and the newspapers would call it justice. There was a time when lies were printed as facts, when mobs acted as judge and executioner, and when the entire machinery of a nation worked together to make terror look respectable. And in that America, one woman stood up and did something almost unthinkable. She investigated. She named names. She followed the evidence. She exposed the lie at the heart of white supremacy. And she did it while death threats circled her, while her newspaper office was destroyed, while powerful men tried to silence her, and while even some allies thought she was too bold, too angry, too dangerous. Her name was Ida B. Wells. She was born into slavery in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and after emancipation, she became one of the most fearless journalists in American history. She documented lynching when many white newspapers justified it. She challenged segregation long before the modern civil rights movement. She fought for black voting rights, black self-defense, and black women's political power. She helped found what became the NAACP, founded Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, and spent her life forcing America to look at crimes it wanted hidden. But here's the part history often softens. Ida B. Wells was not simply a reformer. She was a one-woman counterattack against a system of racial terror. Before Martin Luther King Jr., before Rosa Parks, before the federal government could be pressured into pretending to care, Ida B. Wells was already there, writing with the precision of a prosecutor and the courage of a soldier. That is why many call her the grandmother of civil rights. And once you understand her story, you'll understand something else. The civil rights movement did not begin in the 1950s. It was already burning in the 1880s. And Ida B. Wells was one of its fiercest flames. To understand how she became that woman, we have to begin in a world designed to break people before they ever had a chance to resist. Ida Bell Wells was born on July 16, 1862, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, during the Civil War. She entered the world enslaved, the daughter of James and Elizabeth Wells. But the world around her was changing fast. Union forces took Holly Springs, and the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the legal condition of families like hers. Freedom did not bring safety or equality, but it changed the terms of the fight. Her father became active in Reconstruction-era politics and education, and her parents placed enormous value on learning. Ida attended Shaw University, later Rust College, in Holly Springs. Even as a child, she was being shaped by two forces that would define her life: the brutal reality of race in America, and the belief that black people were entitled to dignity, citizenship, and power. Then, at just 16 years old, disaster hit. In 1878, a yellow fever epidemic tore through the region. Ida's parents died. One of her siblings died too. In an instant, the structure of her life collapsed. Relatives and friends suggested splitting the remaining children up into different homes. For many young women, that would have been the end of childhood and the beginning of helplessness. Ida chose something else. She chose responsibility. She convinced a school administrator that she was old enough to teach, took a job, and fought to keep her siblings together. Think about what that means. A black teenage girl in the post-Reconstruction South, orphaned, grieving, under economic pressure, with the entire society stacked against her, decided that she would become head of the family rather than watch it be broken apart. That wasn't just maturity, that was steel. That was the first public glimpse of the force she would later become. Eventually, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where some of her family had relatives. She continued teaching and pursued more education, including summer study at Fisk and attendance at Lemoyne in Memphis. But Ida was not built to live quietly within unjust systems. Even as a young teacher, she was outspoken, sharp, and unwilling to play the role expected of black women in the South. She began writing for black newspapers, first under the pen name Iola, and quickly showed what would become her signature style: elegant prose, direct moral force, and a complete lack of fear when confronting hypocrisy. And then came the train. In 1884, long before Rosa Parks became a national symbol, Ida B. Wells purchased a first-class ticket and sat in the ladies' car of a Chesapeake, Ohio Southwestern Railroad train. A conductor ordered her to move to a smoking car crowded with other passengers. She refused. He tried to remove her. According to later accounts, she resisted physically and was dragged off the train. It was humiliating, violent, and very public. But Ida did what she would do again and again throughout her life. She turned personal injury into organized resistance. She sued the railroad. She won in local court and was awarded damages, though the Tennessee Supreme Court later reversed the decision and ordered her to pay costs. The legal loss enraged her, but it also clarified her understanding of America. In theory, the law promised justice. In practice, the law often protected racial power. That train incident mattered for more than one reason. It revealed the architecture of Jim Crow before the phrase had fully hardened into law and culture. It showed Wells that discrimination was not random meanness. It was systematic. It was enforced by conductors, judges, lawmakers, and custom all at once. And perhaps most importantly, it taught her that resistance needed witnesses. It needed print. It needed memory. If the oppressor controlled the story, the crime became normal. If the victim told the story, the crime became visible. So she wrote. And Memphis began to notice. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, Wells had become a teacher, editor, and co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, a black newspaper. She wrote about unequal education, racial injustice, and the daily humiliations imposed on black citizens. Her writing was already bold, but in 1892, something happened that transformed her from a regional journalist into one of the most dangerous truth-tellers in America. 3 black men in Memphis, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, were lynched. This was not an anonymous outrage somewhere far away. Thomas Moss was a friend of Wells. She was close to his family. Moss co-owned the People's Grocery, a successful black business that competed with a white-owned store nearby. Tensions escalated after an altercation involving local boys. White hostility intensified. Moss and the others were arrested. Then, in the middle of the night, a masked mob took them from jail and murdered them. One reported last message from Moss was devastating in its clarity. "Tell my people to go west. There is no justice here." That lynching changed Ida B. Wells forever, because now the lie was personal. White newspapers and politicians often portrayed lynching as rough frontier justice, a response to terrible crimes, especially the alleged rape of white women by black men. But Wells knew this case. She knew the men. She understood the context. This was not justice. This was racial terror tied to economic competition and white control. A successful black business had become intolerable. A mob destroyed it. The legal system stepped aside. The message was obvious. Black advancement would be punished with death. Wells responded with journalism that struck like artillery. She wrote editorials urging black Memphians to leave the city and take their money elsewhere. She began to investigate lynching systematically, not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern. She collected testimonies. She read local reports. She compared official narratives to facts on the ground. And what she discovered was explosive. Many lynching accusations, especially the most inflammatory ones, were built on lies, exaggerations, or consensual interracial relationships, reframed as assault. Once white, respectability felt threatened. Wells did not merely condemn lynching as barbaric. She dismantled its propaganda. She exposed the excuse. And for that, white Memphis came for her. In 1892, while Wells was away from the city, a white mob destroyed the office of the Free Speech. Her press was wrecked. Her colleagues were forced to flee. Threats were made against her life. She was effectively exiled from Memphis. She never lived there again. Imagine the pressure of that moment. You tell the truth about racial violence, and the city responds by proving every word you wrote. They did not debate her evidence. They smashed the newspaper. That alone tells you how dangerous her reporting had become. Most people would have gone silent after that. Ida B. Wells became louder. She relocated to New York and wrote for the New York Age, expanding her audience and sharpening her anti-lynching campaign. What followed was one of the most important investigative efforts in American history. Wells studied lynchings across the South, compiled cases, tested the stated reasons against available facts, and proved that lynching was not primarily about punishing crime. It was about maintaining white political, social, and economic dominance after emancipation. Black success, black voting, black land ownership, black independence, all of these could trigger mob violence. Lynching was terror with a public relations department, and Wells tore that department apart. In 1892, she published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In 1895, she followed it with A Red Record, a landmark work that compiled statistics and case studies to document the scale and nature of lynching in the United States. This was not simply activism, it was data-driven investigative journalism, decades before that phrase became fashionable. She treated racial terror as something that could be counted, verified, exposed, and used as evidence against a nation that claimed to be civilized. A Red Record remains one of the foundational texts in the history of American racial violence. And here is what made Wells especially threatening. She did not ask white America to be nicer. She accused it. She did not beg for sympathy. She demanded moral accountability. She was not interested in making the truth comfortable enough for racists to absorb politely. She wanted the truth to wound, to shame, to expose, to mobilize. In that sense, Ida B. Wells was not just ahead of her time, she was ahead of ours. Because even now, people often prefer narratives of racial progress that center patience, moderation, and redemption. Wells offered something far more unsettling: evidence. She looked directly at American violence and said, in effect, here is what you are doing, here is why you are doing it, and here is the lie you tell to excuse it. That was revolutionary. It still is. But Wells understood something else. Facts alone do not move power unless they travel. So she took her campaign beyond the United States. In 1893, and again in 1894, she toured Britain, giving lectures and building support for the anti-lynching cause. British audiences, already shocked by reports of mob violence in the United States, listened. Her tours helped internationalize the issue and embarrass America on the world stage. For a country obsessed with presenting itself as a beacon of liberty, that mattered. Wells used global opinion as leverage against domestic racism. Again, this was strategic thinking far beyond what many imagine from a 19th century reformer. She understood pressure. She understood public image. She understood that if the United States would not listen to black citizens, perhaps it would listen when its reputation was being dragged through transatlantic scrutiny. And even then, she was still not finished. In 1895, she married Ferdinand Barnett, a prominent Chicago attorney and newspaper publisher. She became Ida B. Wells Barnett, though history usually remembers her simply as Ida B. Wells. Marriage did not quiet her public voice. It did not reduce her to a supporting role. She continued writing, organizing, lecturing, and raising a family, while remaining one of the most relentless critics of racial injustice in America. That balance matters, because women reformers are often flattened into saintly symbols or domestic footnotes. Wells was neither. She was a wife, mother, editor, strategist, lecturer, and combatant in the public arena, all at once. Chicago became the next great stage of her life. And here, once again, she refused the safe version of leadership. She protested segregation and exclusion at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. She pushed civil rights organizations to confront real discrimination, rather than settle for symbolic victories. She remained active in black political life and women's organizing. When many white suffrage leaders were willing to sideline black women for tactical reasons, Wells refused to disappear politely. That refusal reached one of its most famous moments in 1913, during the National Woman Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. Organizers attempted to segregate black women and have them march separately. Wells did not accept that insult. Instead, after the parade began, she stepped into the Illinois delegation and marched. It was a public rejection of both racism in the suffrage movement and the idea that black women should wait their turn for dignity. That same year, Wells helped found the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. widely regarded as the first black women's suffrage organization in Illinois. This was not an ornamental club. It was political infrastructure. It educated women, encouraged civic participation, and worked to turn voting rights into actual power for black communities. Wells understood a lesson that still matters. Rights on paper mean little without institutions, organization, and disciplined participation. She was never satisfied with symbolism alone. She wanted leverage, and yet for all her importance, Ida B. Wells often found herself in conflict even with allies. This is one of the most revealing parts of her story. She was too radical for accommodationists, too uncompromising for respectability, politics, too independent for men who were comfortable praising black womanhood in theory, but uneasy with an actual black woman leading in practice. Wells worked with major figures of her era, but she also clashed with them. She challenged timidity. She resented being sidelined. She refused to lower the temperature of her analysis just to remain welcome in elite circles. Even in the story of the NAACP, her role carries tension. She was among the black signers connected to the 1909 call that helped launch the organization, yet questions and disputes over recognition and exclusion followed. That too tells us something important. American movements do not just battle external enemies. They also wrestle internally over ego, ideology, class, gender, and who gets remembered. Wells had the rare misfortune of being right early, right loudly, and right in a way that made people uncomfortable. History often punishes those people before it honors them. And what exactly was Wells right about? Almost everything. She was right that lynching was a tool of racial control, not just a response to crime. She was right that the press could either serve justice or enable terror. She was right that black Americans needed self-defense, political power, and economic strategy, not just appeals to conscience. She was right that women's rights movements that ignored race were morally compromised. She was right that civil rights leadership could not be left entirely in the hands of cautious men who feared offending power more than they feared injustice. And she was right that truth, however dangerous, was a weapon. That is why Grandmother of Civil Rights is not just a flattering title. It is an analytical one, because the methods that later defined the civil rights movement are visible in her life long before the movement acquired its familiar mid-20th century names and images. Investigative exposure, organized protest, economic pressure, legal challenge, international advocacy, black women's political leadership, demand for federal accountability, media strategy, narrative control. Ida B. Wells was doing all of that decades earlier. She was laying track before the train had a name. But like so many pioneers, she paid a price for being first. As the decades passed, some of Wells's positions and style made her less easy to memorialize than more polished or institutionally embraced figures. She could be difficult. She could be combative. She could be suspicious of compromise. She did not fit neatly into schoolbook heroism. That may be precisely why she mattered so much. Movements are not built only by saints who speak in perfect quotations. They are also built by fighters who make themselves inconvenient to power and sometimes to allies. Wells never stopped pushing. In Chicago, she remained involved in civil rights and community work, including the Negro Fellowship League and broader campaigns for black advancement. In 1930, in the final year of her life, she even ran for the Illinois State Senate, a reminder that she never viewed activism as merely moral commentary from the sidelines. She believed in entering the arena. She believed in power, representation, and institutions. She believed that protest without political structure was incomplete. She died on March 25, 1931, in Chicago. No giant state funeral, no universally accepted national canonization, no instant consensus that America had lost one of its greatest journalists. But death did not defeat her argument, because the evidence remained, the writings remained, the courage remained, the method remained, and eventually, history had to come back for her. Over time, Ida B. Wells' reputation has been restored, though never as fully as it should be. Scholars, journalists, and activists have recognized her as a founder of investigative reporting on racial violence and as a central architect of early civil rights activism. In 2020, the Pulitzer Prize Board awarded her a special citation for her outstanding and courageous reporting on violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. The award came nearly a century after her death, which is both fitting and indicting. Fitting, because her journalism deserved it. Indicting, because it took that long. But perhaps even that does not capture the full scale of her legacy. Because Ida B., Wells did more than expose lynching. She changed what journalism could be. She changed what black political resistance could look like. She changed what female leadership could look like. And she changed the moral record of the United States by refusing to let lies pass as history. Think about that. A woman born enslaved in Mississippi became one of the sharpest investigators of American democracy's failure. A young orphan who fought to keep her siblings together became a national voice against state-sanctioned terror. A schoolteacher dragged from a train became a public enemy of white supremacy. A journalist driven from Memphis built an international campaign. A black woman told to wait her turn stepped into the front ranks anyway. That is not just a life. That is an American reckoning. And maybe that is why Ida B., Wells still feels dangerous. Because she leaves us with questions that do not stay safely in the past. What lies are still being told in the name of public order? What forms of violence are still disguised as law, necessity, or tradition? Who is being asked to wait politely while power protects itself? Who gets called divisive simply for providing evidence? And who, right now, is paying the price for telling truths that comfortable people would rather avoid? Those are Ida B. Wells questions. They are not museum questions. They are live questions. Modern questions. American questions. And that is why her story matters so much to us now. Because every era has its preferred amnesia. Every era has its respectable excuses. Every era has people who say, "This is unfortunate but complicated," when what they really mean is, "This is useful to the people in charge." Ida B., Ada 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 B. Wells did not accept that language. She believed the way to right wrongs was to turn the light of truth on them. Not a flicker, not a whisper. A light. A harsh one. A public one. A light bright enough that the nation could no longer pretend not to see what it was doing. That is what she gave us. Not comfort. Not closure. Clarity. If we are honest, that may be harder and more necessary. So when we call her the grandmother of civil rights, we are not speaking only about chronology. We are speaking about inheritance. Because later generations inherited her courage. They inherited her methods. They inherited her refusal. They inherited her understanding that progress is not gifted by the powerful. It is forced into existence by people willing to confront danger and tell the truth anyway. Ida B. Wells stood in that tradition before much of America even knew the tradition had begun. She documented lynching before the country was ready to hear it. She challenged segregation before the nation wanted the case made. She fought for black women's political power before even many reformers fully respected it. She did not wait for history to catch up. She made history chase her. And in the end, maybe that is the clearest way to understand her. Ida B. Wells was not ahead of her time because she belonged to the future. She was ahead of her time because the truth she carried was too large for her century and too honest for her country. But she carried it anyway. And because she did, America can never say it was not warned. If this story changed the way you see the origins of the civil rights movement, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because there are more forgotten architects of history whose lives deserve the full light of truth. And tell me in the comments what struck you most about Ida B. Wells, her journalism, her courage, or the fact that she was fighting the foundations of Jim Crow decades before the movement most people think of had even begun. Because remembering her is not just about honoring the past, it is about recovering the blueprint. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.